Hi, everyone, and welcome to our last Compass Speaker Series of 2020. Thank you for your patience. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, but we're ready to rock right now. So I just wanted to say welcome and thank you all for attending. I'm pretty excited about this one, and I'll explain why in a minute. But before we begin, I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. And we acknowledge the land upon which we sit here at Ryerson. And also we acknowledge the traditional lands where all our attendees and our speaker sits as well. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So I just wanted to introduce a bit today about our Ryerson's Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. So this Compass Speaker Series is part of the initiatives of the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. Our mission is to facilitate and conduct research of both scholarly value and significance to the tourism and hospitality field. Our focus has been to work with industry partners to conduct applied research projects that provide also our students with opportunities to learn and grow. Research conducted through the Institute is on a broad array of topics, including sustainability, destination management and marketing, Indigenous tourism, organizational behavior. We are working on sales currently. We have some other really great research on visiting friends and relatives, and on other aspects such as culinary tourism. For information about our current and past research, please visit our website at htmresearch.ca. We will also find on our website past speakers from Compass Speaker Series, as well as our new podcast that's hosted by the lovely Brian called Behind the Study. And Behind the Study, each episode features a researcher and explores their research background and experiences throughout their careers. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on our website. Season 1 is out now, and more episodes will be coming to you next semester. As well as also with this Compass Speaker Series, we'll be having some more really great speakers coming up in 2021. So today, I'm really excited. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Geoff Wall. He is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Waterloo. And I can tell you a lot about Dr. Wall because he was my PhD supervisor from 2002, I think, till 2007. And he was a professor at the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. So those of you who know Dr. Wall, you will know that I always call him, he's like the godfather of sustainable tourism. I also feel that many of the prolific scholars these days have been under the tutelage of Dr. Geoff Wall. And I find it always really funny that as I meet other tourism scholars around the world, a lot of them went to Waterloo and worked with Geoff. I also fondly remember one time being at an AAG conference, and it was like I was with a celebrity because people were running up to him and saying, "Oh my God, you're Geoff Wall from Matheson and Wall, 1982." So I always felt really privileged to be with Geoff, especially if you were in China as well, because people always knew who Geoff Wall was in China. So Geoff Wall is a prolific writer and researcher who was awarded the prestigious UNWTO Ulysses Prize for Excellence in the Creation and Dissemination of Knowledge. And the prize has particularly valued Professor Wall's pioneer research on tourism and climate change and his work on ecotourism and tourism planning. His ecotourism assessment framework and economic impacts assessment models have been effectively implemented in parks and protected areas in many areas of the world. And most of his research has been undertaken in Asia, with recent emphasis on natural and cultural heritage and Indigenous peoples. So I welcome Dr. Wall to the Compass Speaker Series. And Geoff, we look very forward to hearing what you have to talk about today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Technically, excuse me, technically I retired 10 years ago, although I've still been quite active. But one of the results of that is that I'm less familiar with some of the technologies than some younger people. So I'm struggling a little bit to keep on top of what is going on here, and I apologize for that. But I'll do my best to communicate and hopefully have some time for discussion at the end. My topic is sustainable development, sustainable tourism, and sustainable livelihoods. Can you hear me okay? I guess nobody stopped me, so it is okay. And
Good.
my intention then is to distinguish between these three terms. I will also say a little bit about communities and maybe about participation and involvement, but I'll spend a little less time on that. I hope to briefly mention two case studies and come to some conclusions. So let's start with some terms. Uh, Sustainable development, sustainable tourism, and sustainable livelihoods. Here I've taken from the classic book on sustainable development by the Brundtland Commission, Hergrow Brundtland, which says that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And for that to be achieved, a variety of things must be done, including the maintenance of ecological integrity, meeting basic human needs like food and shelter, water, keeping options open for future generations, reducing injustice, increase self-determination. Can we go on, please? And there's a variety of things which have to be done according to the Brundtland Commission for sustainable development to occur. And the last one here was merging the environment and economics in decision making, something which I will come back to. Okay. In this early discussion then by the Brundtland Commission, 1987, the emphasis was on sustaining the economy and the environment. And there was tension seen between economic development and environmental protection. Culture was rarely mentioned in the discussions, but sustaining culture, I think, is very important. And we move to these three pillars of sustainability: environmental sensitivity, culturally appropriate, and so on. And these ideas have been accepted very widely at all levels, from the United Nations right the way through to local communities, as if they're not controversial. But while they've been accepted very widely and often embedded into plans and policy documents, they're actually extremely difficult to implement. And I'll say in passing that the Brundtland Commission did not even mention tourism. Can we go on, please? The concept is a fuzzy one. Some people emphasize sustainability, by which they mean sustaining the environment or perpetuating forms of human existence so that they will not exceed capacities and that can be maintained indefinitely. Other people emphasize development, which implies change. What this means is that sustainable development means different things to different people. On, please. And so there's considerable variation in the meaning of both sustainability and development, and hence sustainable development. And it leads to such questions as what is to be sustained, what is development, And of course, there's a long history of literature on development from a predominantly economic focus to one which is more all-encompassing, and then with certain other emphases, such as gender and development, concern about what scale we're talking about, and whether sustainable development is dealing with a project, a plan, or a policy, or whether it's a philosophy. Okay? So there's a lot of issues here with sustainable development, which makes it extremely difficult to work with. So while it's very popular in the literature, it's actually very difficult to implement. But what is clear is that sustainability requires a holistic perspective rather than a narrow focus. And this is why I very rarely use the word sustainable tourism. Tourism competes with other potential uses for the scarce resources of land, water, waste assimilation capacity, labor, capital, and so on. So the issues are often competition between uses. And while we talk about sustainable almost everything, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, sustainable cities, sustainable fisheries, and indeed sustainable tourism, the issues are the intersections between these various sectors. And the term sustainable tourism means that one has already accepted that tourism is an appropriate use. It seems to, in fact, prevent the opportunity for saying that tourism should not occur in this particular location because there are other higher and more suitable uses. So I don't tend to use the word sustainable tourism, regarding it as much too narrow. So the strength of the sustainability literature, sustainable development literature, is that it facilitates dialogue. The weakness is that it's quite limited in its use as an analytical tool, as I say, at least in the absence of refinement. Okay, please. Sustainability can only be determined in retrospect. And what we've seen is the development of indicators, which has been basically a huge research thrust, which gets us into issues of monitoring and evaluation. Okay? Faced with these issues, I've turned to the idea of sustainable livelihoods. And there's a definition of sustainable livelihoods on the screen here. I find this as a more tangible way of moving forward. Can we move on, please? Sustainable livelihoods is people-centered, first of all. And so we're focusing on people without neglecting the environment and the economy and so on. And it recognizes that many people, particularly poor people, have multiple sources of livelihood. They're not doctors or farmers or fishermen or teachers. They're in fact doing many different things in order to sustain themselves. And the focus of the sustainable livelihoods notion is on livelihood security, trying to make sure that people have a secure livelihood over a long period of time so that they can recover from stresses or shocks and make use of a wide variety of their assets. Can we go on, please? So what I've tried to argue so far is that sustainable development lacks the conceptual precision for it to be readily measured or for it to act as a clear guide for academic research. I've suggested that its fuzziness can bring people together with differing perspectives, which is good, but they find out that they in fact often don't agree on what should be done. I've argued that a multisectoral perspective is essential, and I've tried to suggest to you that the sustainable livelihoods approach may be helpful in helping to resolve some of these problems, although I've yet to say very much about sustainable livelihoods. Okay. I'm going to make some very brief comments on communities, because often what we're trying to sustain is communities. And this gets us into notions of what is a community. We have to recognize that communities are very diverse, and not everybody in a community thinks the same way. So communities vary between places, and within places, within single communities, there are people with power, without power, people with different goals and objectives, and so on. And they're made up of people of varying characteristics, young people, old people, women, men, so on. So our communities have very different potentials to be sustainable. And this is going to vary with the location, with the resources that are available to them, with the institutional arrangements for their development, with power structures, and so on. Thank you. And in fact, while there's a huge literature on community development in tourism, sometimes I think the notion of the term community hides more than it actually reveals. It's like a black box, which one has to unwrap and get into to discover what's inside. And I think that since tourism, by definition, requires the involvement of outsiders, tourists, by definition, come from somewhere else, and often investment comes from somewhere else, and so on. One might ask, to what extent is community-based tourism even possible? And it's worth asking if small, poor communities can develop tourism successfully without outside input. And in fact, I have identified a term which I'll come back to, cosmopolitan locals, local people who may in fact be able to take initiatives locally because of their outside contacts and outside experiences. Okay. Participation is crucial. The initial literature talks about participation in decision-making. Perhaps more important is involvement in benefits and the relationships between decisions and benefits, types of participation, and in fact, there's probably a participatory spiral whereby people get involved in decisions, get some benefits, which makes them more likely to be involved in future decisions and get more benefits, and so on. One feeds on the other. Okay? Now I want to illustrate some of these things by introducing two case studies. The first is from central Sardinia in Italy, and involves a small town called Mamayada and the Mask Museum, which exists there. And the second is in central Taiwan, in Alishan and Chashan. Can we go on, please? Of course, this is not all my own work, and just as one should always reference one's sources, I want to say right away that the work in Sardinia was done with Dr. Monica Iorio of the University of Cagliari and was facilitated by the Museum of Mediterranean Masks. And the work in central Taiwan was facilitated by Dr. Janet Chang of the Chinese Culture University in Kaohsiung in South Taiwan. And much of the work was done by Teresa Tao. So I'm drawing upon the work that I did with them. Mamayada is in Sardinia, and it has a very famous festival which occurs on the 16th and 17th of January every year. And I was there at that festival in 2009, and that is where the first set of information comes from. It's a little bit old, but it's been updated since. Can we go on, please? So here we are. Being a geographer, there's some maps. We're in Italy, the island. Can we go on quickly, please? Sardinia off in the Mediterranean Sea. Here's a map of Sardinia. Oh, can we just go back? The study site is near Nuoro in central Sardinia. The main town is Cagliari on the southern tip. And so there's a drive of several hours northwards and then veering towards the east to get up towards Nuoro, where the study site is. So it's a reasonable difference from Cagliari. So it's remote in that sense, but it does have some accessibility in the sense that one can drive there in a couple of hours. Okay, next, please. This is a view of our community. It fits many of the criteria, the traditional criteria of community being very distinct, fairly self-contained, and so on. You could easily draw a boundary around that particular place. Next, please. And when one gets into it, it looks like this. It's a fairly poor community, built mainly of stone, which is important because the festival involves fire. Next, please. So Mamayada, our village, is a small, distinct community in an attractive location. It's accessible, but still fairly remote from the main city. It has a recent history of poverty and lawlessness, which I'll explain in just a moment. This history of poverty and lawlessness is widely recognized, but it possesses some tourism resources, particularly this nice environment and this special festival, and it's in the very early stages of tourism development. Next, please. This book by Grazia Deleda, Ashes, is about the poverty and lawlessness in Mamayada. And in fact, author Grazia Deleda was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Can we go on? This is a book by D.H. Lawrence, which is called The Sea in Sardinia, which describes a train journey which goes up close to Mamayada and once again talks about the poverty and the crime in this area. Can we go on? This is a movie, La Destinazione, and in this particular movie, a young policeman has just qualified, and his first job, he is sent to Mamayada, and this is regarded as a hard luck post. Of course, it all works out well in the end. He finds somebody nice and gets married. But the impression I'm trying to give here is that this was an area full of crime and families killing each other, stealing sheep, and so on, and was certainly not the place that most people would choose to visit. Next, please. So again, it's a pleasant but not exceptional village. It has a history of craftsmanship, excellent food and wine, as many Italian villages do, but it has an unusual and very impressive event. And this event is for local people, but it's of growing interest to tourists. Next, please. Local crafts. Next, please. So this event occurs on the 16th and 17th day of January every year. And in these 2 days, fires are lit throughout the village. And the year I was there, 39 fires were lit throughout this small village. And people congregated around these fires. That's why it's important that the village is built of stone and not wood. Otherwise, of course, it might burn down. But around the fires, wine and food is shared freely. And I mean freely, it's given away. And festivities extend late into the night. But the first night is only for local people, no outsiders. Next, please. So here's what's going on the first night. People are singing, dancing, enjoying themselves, drinking wine and food. Next, please. And in fact, on the first night, I was round one of the fires, obviously an outsider, and I didn't have a camera, and I wasn't trying to take a video. And one of the locals said to me, "This is for us. You can't bring cameras and take videos here." But after explaining that I was very interested in the history of the place and its culture, and I was there in association with the museum, and we drank a few glasses of wine, he said to me, "Come back next year." but you should speak Sardinia. Italian is not so important. A local feeling here and pride in culture. But on the second day, the Mamertones and the Isoadores appear. Can you just flip down quickly? Next, this is a Mamertone, a masked figure covered with sheepskin and heavy black boots, carrying bells. Next, please. And the Isoadores are more effeminate. They carry ropes with which they lasso people in the village as they parade through and walk around the fires. Next, please. Here the men are getting ready to parade through all 39 bonfires and drink wine and eat food. The bells are extremely heavy. Next, that's fine. And they dance rhythmically. And so, in fact, there's a sound like ka-chack, 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 as they actually stamp their feet and the bells ring behind them. And in the bottom right picture, you can see the Isoadores lassoing people to reel them in, usually pretty women. Next, please. Next, please. And here's one of the local ladies freely giving away her cooking. And wine is given away free to anybody who comes. Next, please. It's tiring work. The bells are very heavy, and one's walking up and down the steep slopes and dancing around the bonfire. Next, please. I was talking to one of the more famous Mamertones, who was in fact one of the posters which was produced to advertise the event. He in fact got a call on his cell phone while we were eating pizza together. Of course, it was pizza, and he showed me a copy of the old poster, and we got talking more and more. And he said, "When I die, I want to be buried as a Mamertone." By that he meant with his sheepskin coat and his bells and his boots. This is then a very important local cultural event. Next, please. The institutions are very important. There are, in fact, two organizations which arrange the Mamertones and the Isoadores. They have a slightly different role. One is very conservative and only arranges for events to take place within the community. The second has, in fact, as the event has become more famous, has taken groups of Mamertones and Isoadores to other communities to perform. The more traditional people think that this is not appropriate. But this was just a one-day event, the second day of the two-day event in January every year, not something you can really build tourism upon. But some young people from the village who left to get an education returned. And they recognized the great significance and the interest that there might be in this special event. And they took initiatives and eventually got money together to establish the Museum of Mediterranean Masks. So there's now a building. And if you have a building with a display, you have potential to have visitors 365 days a year instead of one day a year. Next, please. And so these people I've called cosmopolitan locals. They're local people who understand the culture, who have the local contacts, who know the power structure and so on, but they've gone outside and they've got an education and they've seen what tourism is like and they've come back. In my area, in St. Jacobs, there's a Mennonite community which has become famous for tourism. And one of the local movers and shakers there Milo Shantz, who unfortunately died just about 4 years ago, was a Mennonite who understood Mennonite culture, understood what was acceptable and not acceptable, and has managed to develop a very famous market, which has become the core of a tourist attraction. So cosmopolitan locals then are local people with vision and exposure to the outside world who have returned to take initiatives to develop tourism in their home area. Next, please. So what's going to happen here? We're beginning to see the initial stages of commodification of culture. What will happen when the tour buses arrive? When people come by car, how are they going to park their cars? Are they going to charge for this? Are they still going to be able to give away the wine and the food freely? Or are they going to have to charge for this? How are the local people going to maintain control over their event? Next, please. So we can ask, can we just go back, please? What will happen in the future? The next one. Here, for example, is a computer mat, which I was given with a mammotone on it. It's sold now. The local community doesn't benefit from this. This was bought in Cagliari. Next, please. Here is a postcard with an American cartoon character dressed as a mammotone. These aren't very common, but it was being sold in Cagliari. Once again, the local people don't get any benefit from this, and yet their culture is being commodified and sold to visitors. Next, please. So in summary, community attributes are heterogeneous, but not all of them have a special event. There are great differences in need for and interest in tourism, great differences in accessibility, resources, institutions, power relations, and so on, and even the presence of cosmopolitan localists. So not everything everywhere is going to operate in the same way. Not everywhere has tourism attractions. But I think looking at a case study like this, one can see the possibilities and the challenges. Since I did this case study, I've returned, and there's now a second museum of this time rural agricultural products and the history and so on. Next, please. So I want to leave that in your mind and take you to another location, this time Taiwan, with a focus on Aboriginal people. And I want to visit two communities in the Chou area of Alishan in central Taiwan. Next, please. And we're going to be talking here about participation, decision-making, benefits, and so on. I'm going to go through this very quickly because time is short and I want to leave time for some discussion. So let's move on, please. And in fact, the relationship between decision-making is complex. There are at least 4 possibilities here on the relationships between decision-making, yes, no. Do you get benefits? Yes, no. And these broad categories hide a great deal about exactly how participation takes place. How do people actually get involved? What do they do? And how do they benefit? Next, please. So here's a map which shows where Taiwan is by the arrow there. These are maps of Taiwan, central Taiwan in the top left, and a more detailed location of our study area in central Taiwan, the main part of the display here. Next, please. This is an environment in which we're working, mountainous and relatively remote once again. Next, please. This is the community that we're talking about, the Chou community here standing in front of the Kuba, which is the men's main, how can we call it, club, if you like. Next, please. Once again, here's our definition of sustainable livelihoods, recognizing that people sustain themselves and their families and communities in multiple ways. Next, please. And this is a more complex diagram, which I've taken from others. Sustainable livelihoods as a concept began in the rural development literature. And I've, along with my students, basically stole it from there and moved it into tourism, and then tried to work with it in a tourism context. The top line talks about contexts and conditions, various resources, the institutional and organizational processes, which I think are very important, and I've shaded here, livelihood strategies, and the kinds of outcomes that one might recognize. In fact, the bottom right-hand box here reflects work which we did in the 1980s in Bali. So the diagram has been modified. Can we move on, please? So we're talking here then about tourism not replacing existing activities, but tourism as a means of livelihood diversification. In many of these small communities, it's a new activity for local people. It's a risky activity. So we're viewing it as an addition to what is going on rather than as a substitute. And we're asking, can tourism be incorporated into local people's livelihood portfolios? And how does it fit? Does it fit well with what they're doing, or does it displace other activities? How can it be integrated into existing activities? How can local people participate and benefit from tourism? Next, please. The village of Shanmei developed its river into an ecotourism and cultural tourism attraction. Its small river was stocked with fish, and visitors came to see the fish and eat the fish and feed the fish, and it generated quite a lot of money. Chashan, the other case, failed in that approach, but it set up pavilions where visitors could come and sit and meet with local people and hear their stories and eat food. So they had rather different approaches to their tourism development. Can we go on, please? This is the first study site. This is the local chief. This is the guy on the left. The local chief, who was the mind behind the development. He was a Christian, and he went to South Africa to visit some of the churches in South Africa, saw some of the game parks, and came back and said, we could do that with our valley and our river. But it took him several years to persuade local people that visitors would come and pay money to visit their community. Next, please. This is their river. It fluctuates greatly from season to season. There are pools in the river like this, which have been stocked with fish. Next, please. This is the fish. Next. And this is the other village. Here, the strategy was a little bit different. Next, please. They built pavilions, as I said. People sat outdoors, ate food, heard stories, and gained an insight into local culture that way. Next, please. And this is shows you the livelihood activities in these two villages. Many people move, especially the men, into the cities to get work and send money home. A lot of money is gained in casual labor, working on the roads which need repairing quite often in this extreme environment. Tourism is about was about 1/5 of the income in each community. There's some traditional farming and harvesting. Fishing has stopped because they're protecting the fish in that stream for tourism purposes. And hunting is no longer very important, although it would have been in the past. Next, please. So here we have agriculture. Next. More agriculture. Here we have gathering herbs, collecting honey, hunting, performing for tourists. A wide variety of activities going on. And here we have local people building places for tourists to stay, using local raw materials and local skills. Next, please. And this is the source of tourism income in our first study site. And there's income from within the park. They established a park so that people could visit and experience their fish, eat fish, experience the culture. So there are wages to the park director. There are restaurants, food stalls, handicraft stores, and so on. Tour guides, temporary employment for park repairs, and so on. And as the initial ecotourism park has been successful, so there have been new establishments set up outside of the park, lodges and so on. Next, please. Here is a dance troupe. Not all young and beautiful here. Everybody gets to dance, and they take turns to do this. So there's performances. Next, please. This is a local seniors. They're meeting to enjoy each other's company. Here they are weaving in traditional ways. Next, please. And the baskets are sold to tourists. Next, please. Local agricultural produce and drinks sold to tourists. These are local drinks, jelly figs. And here we have a pig roasted, again, being sold to tourists. Come for local meals. Next, please. Chashan is rather different. Here, people came and stayed in guest houses, and they sat in those pavilions and heard stories and ate local food. Next, please. So here's a building. The top of the building, you can stay in. It's a bed and breakfast. The bottom two floors are a pottery and a restaurant. Next, please. Here we have a local person sharing local knowledge, explaining the local utility of local plants to tourists from the city. Next. Local transportation, and again, local food. And joining in festivities in the evening. So we might ask, how does tourism fit into these communities? First of all, it delivers the consumer to the products. The tourists are driving to the communities where they will buy fresh products and food, rather than the food and the products being sent to the city. This increases local cash earnings, and the villagers need cash for engaging with the broader economy. It links with other sectors, such as agriculture. The tourism activities provide farm and off-farm diversification. They're not displacing existing activities, and they suit the current lifestyle and the situation. They involve casual labor. In many cases, the males have migrated to the city for work. The females do domestic work, office jobs, and so on. So it fits in with the kind of lifestyle that is going on in the area without displacing it. Next, please. Let's move on, please. Next, please. So here is a diagram which shows the notion of sustainable livelihoods, which I introduced earlier. It's been modified here, and because we're dealing with an Aboriginal group. And so culture reappears many times in this modified diagram. We're dealing with Joe culture and the institutions that are the focus of Joe culture, a culture which shares things among everybody. So everybody gets to be a dancer. Everybody gets to participate in different ways at different times in the tourism offerings. And it's a culture which is different from the broader culture of Taiwan. It's an indigenous culture. And so we've got culture as context. Okay, let's keep going. But they're in a very vulnerable situation, and particularly from environmental hazards. And Typhoon Morakot hit the communities very badly in 2009. And here, of course, it absolutely disrupted tourism. And they were fortunate, in fact, that they were not solely dependent upon tourism, because tourism was basically eliminated. And as you will see, Chiang Mai and Chashan had different experiences. Next, please. So this is our site that I showed you with the fish in it. It's been totally destroyed by a typhoon. Next, please. Next, please. The village was totally cut off. They couldn't get out. Tourists couldn't get in. The roads had to be totally reconstructed. And this is part of the reconstruction going on. Next, please. And here we have an attempt, the early attempts to redevelop tourism, as here they're trying to interpret the changes that have taken place in the environment, so the first tourists could begin to understand what had actually happened. Next, please. This is very sad. This is the very last day when government money, which had been put into the communities to try to help support them, was running out. Using government money, they actually developed a dance troupe. But the money to support people couldn't get to see the dance troupe because the road infrastructure was broken. The money was going to run out. This was the last day. So in fact, this was a strategy which didn't really work. And in fact, some other communities which were not disrupted were able to take advantage of the fact that they were accessible, whereas Alashan was not. Next, please. Chashan really moved out of tourism entirely. What it did was develop local products, mostly baskets. And here we're in the testing phase where they're trying to develop new products and do it carefully. They didn't want people rushing to the urban markets to sell before they tested their products, make sure they were of good quality and reliable. Next, please. These are some of their products. Next. So what I've tried to say then is that sustainable development is a difficult concept to work with. I've tried to say that sustainable tourism, as with all single sector approaches, is much too narrow. And I'm suggesting that sustainable livelihoods offers a much more practical way forward. It acknowledges that in many communities, especially poor communities, and this is true of Sardinia as well as these areas in Taiwan, these poor communities are not supported by one narrow activity. It acknowledges the multiple sources of livelihood, and it tries to contribute to the resilience of communities through diversification. Next, please. So community and participation are related concepts, but they really hide as much as they reveal. because the communities are very different. The way they can participate is very different. And so there are interesting questions such as, can small communities in remote locations develop competitive tourism products in the absence of outside input? What is the role of cosmopolitan locals, those people with outside knowledge who can link the small community with the outside market? What is the role of outside expertise and resources to help these communities? They can do a lot themselves. The concepts that we use are often very imprecise. What does community-based tourism actually mean? Is it possible? And so on. Maybe I'll stop there and saying that sustainable livelihoods is a concept which I found extremely useful. I've been working probably with this concept now for about 10 years. I have many examples done mostly with students and young colleagues, mostly from mainland China, where we've looked at how tourism can be integrated into communities so that it, in fact, enhances those communities and does not displace existing activities. Thank you for listening to me. I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Okay.
I said, thank you so much, Jeff. This is an area that I work in myself, and so it's very nice to hear your points of view and your two case studies. I do have one question, so if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and we will we'll bring it up. And Professor Dimitrios Bouhalis said, "Fantastic as always, Jeff." And thank you. He needs to go.
Okay.
Dory Davari has a question. She wants to know, what are your thoughts about the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage and having an intangible cultural asset inscribed? How could that help sustainability? And she wants to know, what if governments of specific countries would rather have those cultural assets vanished for their own short-term benefits? Governments that are not necessarily the representative of the people, like in Iran.
Well, let's take the intangible cultural heritage first. An interesting case which we've been looking at recently. Sometimes it's good to have tangible things in the sense that we need things to sell, we need things to exchange, we need things to do. And often I think the difference between tangible and intangible heritage is very imprecise. And I'm not sure the division is always a very helpful one. I think that cultural heritage needs to be shared, and it needs to be also protected, and it needs to be able to evolve. And I think those people whose heritage it is are the best people to say what they want to share and what they want to protect. And so I think since it's their heritage, they need to be involved and need to be listened to. If the heritage is going to be protected, evolved in appropriate ways, and shared with meaning. So I don't think top-down ways are the way to really develop cultural heritage assets. And so I think bottom-up ways are the way to go, and it will make the heritage a little bit more distinctive. That doesn't mean to say, though, that outside involvement isn't necessary. because local people in these poor areas haven't been tourists in many cases. They don't often understand fully what is special about their particular offerings and location and activities. And so that is why local people who have outside experience and who can come back are very important. I think that top-down programs can certainly help by providing resources and so on. But I think a bottom-up way involving local people is largely a better way to go.
Great, thank you. Um, I have a question about, you know, there's a lot of talk these days. Sustainability or sustainable tourism is not really discussed as much as now, you know, the movement is towards transformative tourism or regenerative tourism. And my colleague Rachel Dodds and I have been having this discussion a lot. Because it's especially in industry, you know, there are a lot of speakers that are really talking about this as kind of the new way of doing things. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on both transformative, regenerative, and sustainable tourism. If you could comment upon that.
Well, I think that we need to recognize that most tourism is mass tourism. And maybe that's good and maybe it's bad. I mean, most or many academics, of course, frown on mass tourism. But maybe it's fortunate that many people can congregate together in specific locations where they can be managed and can enjoy themselves while doing that. And that they don't need to be dispersed across every little village and every small community and so on, where they would be particularly disruptive. So I think we have to be realistic about what people want and what people are willing to do and so on. I think that it's dangerous to go from one industry perspective and replace it by another industry, such as tourism. I mean, virtually most tourism destinations now are struggling because if they focus solely on tourism, in COVID, they've got nothing to fall back on. And so there's a lot to be said about diversity, diversity of economy, finding particular niches, integrating tourism with other activities. And so the approach that I've taken is that we don't want to replace existing activities unless they need to be replaced. We wish to enrich offerings which are compatible with the existing activities. But without outside help, local communities or local people often don't know what is special about their particular potential offerings, because often the culture is taken for granted. What is commonplace to them may be very unusual or very special for outsiders. So here, of course, we're dealing with, in both of the case studies that I've presented here, remote rural communities. But I think many of the similar kinds of issues arise with ethnic communities in urban areas and so on. How can one respect the culture and share it at the same time? And that does require a relatively small numbers of people so that the culture is not swamped. It may mean charging higher prices as a result, but I think that it's easy to put labels: transformative, sustainable, whatever. Ultimately, I think it's a question of looking at communities and deciding what will work. Often the labels are good guidelines, but bad masters. You have to look at the resources in an area. You take a particular type of tourism, maybe something like ecotourism, and very few places have the potential to offer ecotourism in its purest sense. But many of them can provide opportunities to interesting landscapes or interesting natural areas and so on. I don't think we should be confined by the terms. I think when one gets down into real places, one has to assess what the potential is and what people are interested in doing, and trying to do things which will not displace existing activities unless those activities are deemed to be harmful for some reason, but to enrich the possibilities. And so I see tourism as a form of enrichment rather than something that is replacing existing activities.
Great, thank you so much. So what is your thought about, tourism continuing, or people traveling currently during a pandemic to small island states, for example? There's several, say, Canadians, for example, that are going down to Barbados or Aruba or Jamaica at this point in time during a pandemic. Do you have any thought about how, is there an ethical implication with that, or is that just, economics in the sense that they need some assistance? I would love to know your thought on that at this time.
To be honest, I haven't thought about it very much. I'm somebody who used to travel a lot, probably further than most people, until the pandemic started, and since then I've not gone anywhere because I felt that I needed to stay very close to home. What is interested, it's not something that I have any particular information on or any particular insights to. I have heard, for example, that some natural area, and I'm talking in the Canadian context now, that some natural areas within quite close proximity to cities have in fact experienced a lot of tourism in relatively recent months, the end of the summer, before winter came on, as people wanted to get out of the confines of the city. They felt hemmed in by the pandemic and so on, and wanted to get out. So accessible outdoor places have done quite well, I understand. Long distance international travel doesn't seem to me to be very viable in most cases, because of the fact that one needs to convalesce in many cases. I used to visit China 4 times, sometimes 5 times a year, where most of my research has been done in recent years. But I haven't been there, I haven't even thought about it. If I got there, I'd be confined for 2 weeks. And when I get back, I'd be confined for 2 weeks. And that's as a researcher. I suspect it's somewhat similar as a tourist. So I think that staying relatively close to home makes a lot of sense as a potential tourist. But that's easy for me to say. I'm older than most people that I talk to. I have the opportunity to travel more than most. So I don't see the urge to go to the other side of the world. And that maybe some people do. So I've been quite comfortable staying close to home. but I must admit I've not spent much money, so my economic contribution to tourist areas has been minimal.
Mhm.
I don't have any particular insights to offer on this particular issue, other than I think that the extra urban destinations, in other words, those which can be reached in a day trip from home, some of them seem to be doing fairly well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, it's an interesting time for domestic tourism. Um, I have a question from Arash Arshik, and he says, thanks for the insightful meeting. How can we address the risks such as museumization of local people associated with tourism, the tourism development model that you prescribed in the second case presented?
The second case, that I presented, the Alishan case in Taiwan, I don't believe those people were being museumified at all. In fact, they were in control of their entire development. It was their choice to share their culture and way of life and do what they wanted to do. And so they were not museumified at all. I think in both of those cases that I shared with you, the initiative was essentially a local one. It was under local control. It did not involve outside investment. It was a way they had chosen to share their culture and resources with the broader world and benefit from it. So I don't think in either of those cases was the culture frozen, and it certainly did not. Well, the Alishan case, the Taiwan case, didn't really displace a lot. The place with the river went heavily into tourism. Their choice. Nobody forced it onto them. They chose to go that route. And of course, when tourism collapsed, they suffered much more than their neighbor Chashan, that went more modestly into tourism and then, in fact, got out of tourism directly to provide other products. So I think in the cases that I shared with you, it was predominantly local control, and they had chosen to go the route that they had. And I don't think it was really museumification. I think they had chosen to share their resources and their culture, but not sell out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Local control was retained here.
Mm-hmm.
In both cases, this didn't involve outside investment in large amounts or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, they retained their control. I have a question from one of our students. She's actually from Barbados, but lives in Canada. Her name is Salome Waisaki. She said, thank you for this insightful talk. Do you believe the pandemic will have influenced people's views on tourism, and that post-pandemic, there may be a higher demand and need for the sustainable livelihoods approach to tourism?
I think that the pandemic itself will not influence tourism patterns in the long run as much as people think. In the short spaces of time where we have seen large numbers of people move, and I'm thinking, for instance, of young people going to the beaches in the United States and so on, we've seen people doing much what they were doing before, going to the beach in large numbers and so on. I think they will want that. They will want that to return. I think that the opportunity to change is much less than people think and may like or would like. For example, the hotel structure, the accommodation structure, has not changed radically. People will, first of all, want to fill up the empty bed spaces and so on that were in particular locations providing particular activities. Coastal locations, mountains, they will still want to visit those places and use that infrastructure. So there's a lot of unused supply which needs to be picked up initially before we can start talking about alternatives to that supply. So I'm less convinced than many that things will move in a totally different direction. I think that as academics, and I assume it's mostly academics involved in this particular discussion, often we think about what we would like to do as individuals and assume other people would like to do those kinds of things as well. But we're a distinct group of people, and we're not necessarily the normal market that interprets things in the way that everybody else does. So I think initially people will want to go back to the beaches and the mountains as they did before, and the plant will be there, empty, waiting for them to fill it up again. So while this is a major dislocation in tourism happens, I see a desire both on the part of suppliers and much of the demand to return to what was there before, rather than to generate something which is completely new. I probably have a different perspective on that than most people. Not many people are saying that.
Yeah, well, and that gets me to my point, my burning question. I think, you've been talking about this. It's 1982. We're talking almost 40 years right now, and are you concerned? Are you frustrated? Are you concerned, or do you think that the world is moving, tourism is moving in a good place, or do you just look at it and shake your head and say nobody listened?
Well, I mean, I try to separate what I like to do and what I want to continue to do, and what I observe other people doing. I see many people writing about tourism, wishing that all tourists were like them, but fortunately they're not. I mean, if everybody who concentrates on the beaches, for example, or skis the hills, became an eco-tourist, a genuine eco-tourist, then in fact there would be it would be much worse. The fact that many people can get an enjoyable experience concentrating in large numbers in a small location where they can be more readily managed is in many ways fortunate, because if they were widely dispersed, they would have far more impacts and they would be much more difficult to manage. As I think about my own situation as somebody who has studied tourism and has also been a tourist, I feel that I can enjoy many different situations. I've had the great fortune to experience the real extremes, many places before tourism has actually started, and also places, some of the cities of the world, and so on, where there are masses and masses of tourists. And for me, the opportunity to have different experiences is very important. So I could go into the wilderness, and indeed I have. I've camped on Baffin Island and hiked in a Weetook National Park when the only other people in this huge park in Baffin Island were 2 or 3 climbers from Spain. That's about as remote as you can get as a tourist. I've had that kind of experience. And I've also watched sporting events with almost 100,000 people in the stadium. And I enjoyed them both. And I've enjoyed many situations in between. So it's not all or nothing. It's an opportunity. It's providing a range of choices, and people will make different choices about what they want to do, and different choices at different times. And so, am I an eco-tourist? Well, I have been. Am I an urban tourist? Well, I've been that too. And for me, a healthy situation is one where there are lots of choices that can be exercised. And individuals will exercise different choices at different times. And that's what a rich life for me is about. And so there are many different types of tourists and many different types of destinations. And rather than looking down at people that, as many academics do, who can get an enjoyable experience along with large numbers of other people, maybe we need to be thankful that not everybody wants to be an eco-tourist.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a very good point and a very good perspective. So I think we will wrap it up because we're coming close to our time, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I know everyone, you have lots of thank yous on here saying how much they've learned, and thank you so much. You could scroll through the chat if you want to see all the thank yous. Yeah. And great presentation. But I personally thank you very much. I'm quite happy to always listen to your thoughts and your perceptions on something that's so very near and dear to me. So I've been working in sustainable livelihoods and with Indigenous communities for the last number of years as well. So I feel like I've been trained well. So thank you very much. Again, lovely to see you. It was too bad we couldn't do this in person, but COVID just happened when we had you. But as soon as this is done, we'll have you back in person at Ryerson, because I know that you've never been hosted there. So we're going to change that. We're going to have you as soon as this lifts up. So thank you for everyone coming. This was the last edition of Compass for 2020. But we have an exciting lineup of speakers planned for the winter semester. Follow us again, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and htmresearch.ca. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated. And thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see you at our next virtual event. And happy holidays to everybody, and end to 2020. So thank you all. Lovely to see you guys. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Best wishes to all. Bye for now.
Bye.